Thanks. I would like, first of all, to express our gratitude to our co-sponsors, the Human Flourishing Program at Harvard. Professor Matt Lee, who's Director of Research at the program, is here tonight. And thank you, Matt, for co-sponsoring the event with us. And also thank Harvard University for making Tsai Auditorium available to us this evening. Founded in 2014, the Abigail Adams Institute is an independent scholarly institute dedicated to providing supplementary humanistic education to Harvard. We explore questions of deep human concern, of ultimate meaning and purpose, and we, throughout the year, we try to provide a range of programming, including reading and discussion groups, workshops, lectures, intellectual retreats, conversations with faculty, mentoring, while our summer seminars attract students and scholars from around the world. The name of the Institute honors the Massachusetts native, Abigail Adams, whose capacious learning, judicious insight, and wise counsel shaped the founding and early development of the American nation. And we also have a fellowship program, a fairly developed fellowship program by now. You can check it out at our website, and I would encourage you, if you're interested in that, to see me after the lecture or at our reception. I'll tell you what it all entails. We have faculty fellows, graduate student fellows, as well as undergraduate fellows. Every year, the Institute hosts a public lecture meant to introduce arguments and speakers who can expand the philosophical horizons of our audience and help us reimagine the intellectual and cultural possibilities of the present. This is our 4th annual lecture, and it's my sincere pleasure to welcome a good man and a first-rate scholar as this year's speaker. Professor Daniel J. Mahoney is the Augustine Chair in the Department of Political Science at Assumption College in Worcester, Massachusetts. Professor Mahoney is known for his written and edited books on French philosophers and political thinkers, including Raymond Aron, Bertrand de Jouvenel, and Charles de Gaulle. He's also deeply interested in Russian political and philosophical thought, as is manifest in this new book he will tell us more about today. And most notable in this regard is his work on the Russian patriot dissident, Alexander Solzhenitsyn. The book is titled The Ascent from Ideology. One of the books is titled The Ascent from Ideology, and it has been widely reviewed and appreciated. Professor Mahoney is seen frequently on the lecture circuit. He's also very productive. He writes in academic journals, but also in journals that perhaps some of you have heard and others haven't heard, but some obscure journals to some of us is the Hungarian Review, which I learned about this afternoon, which looks very interesting. I highly recommend it. Maybe we'll get it at the Institute. But also First Things, Wall Street Journal, National Review, and the more familiar outlets. He's also a popular teacher, a lecturer. He teaches courses in the political science department at Assumption under titles like Ideology and Revolution, Classical Utopias, Political Leadership, Political Economy, and so on and so forth. Today, we will speak on the idol of our age, and Dan, it is my pleasure to welcome you as our speaker. Dan will speak for about 45 minutes, and then we'll have a question and answer session.
And you just tell me when I'm supposed to wind down, and I'll be happy to do so. Thank you very much for that kind introduction, Danilo. Can you hear me? All right. All right. I'm going to present you today with some of the themes of my most recent book, which is entitled The Idol of Our Age: How the Religion of Humanity Subverts Christianity. If publishers don't like subtitles, or at least long ones, they don't like really long ones, but I would add, and also something like Free and Decent Politics. Now, that's much too long, but you get the point. I think the religion of humanity contributes to an undermining of customary and biblical morality, but it also contributes to a kind of depoliticization of modern society and modern politics. And I hope all of that will become clearer in the course of my presentation. I first gave a talk about 4 years ago to the Tocqueville Forum at Furman University. And it was the first time I'd given a talk where 150 people revolted. all the secular leftists revolted and all the progressivist Christians revolted. So that encouraged me to write this book, because I was doing something right. I was giving a name and an analysis to what is perhaps the dominant ethos of the age. So let me begin by simply asking, what is humanitarianism? In what ways is it a religion? What's its relationship to major ideological currents in the contemporary world, like socialism, Marxism, secular humanism? To begin with, by humanitarianism, I do not mean an admirable concern with good works or the corporal works of mercy. I'm not a Randian. I'm not opposed to altruism and love. Everyone admires the Doctors Without Borders, even if, as I shall argue, the churches must be careful not to construe themselves as NGOs, as humanitarian, non-governmental organizations. So I'm going to present a sort of in a nutshell what I develop in a more philosophical and scholarly way in the book. Let me say humanitarianism, or sometimes following Comte, Auguste Comte and Mill, they both spoke about a religion of humanity. Mill, by the way, sent a yearly stipend to Auguste Comte. Would you send money to Auguste Comte? I hope not. But he did. They both spoke about a religion of humanity. And I'm going to use these terms, religion of humanity and humanitarianism, more or less coextensively. So humanitarianism draws on Christianity, but radically distorts it in the process. I would add, following Earl Colnay, that humanitarianism sort of presupposes, even as it subverts Christianity. Since Christianity is a transpolitical religion, it's universalist, the corporal works of mercy are essential, it's very easy to see how secular humanitarians could appropriate humanitarianism, even how some Christians could, in the end, simply see no difference whatsoever between Christianity and religion of humanity. Humanitarianism tends to see the human being as the measure of everything, and to forget the transcendental dimensions of authentic religion. It dedicates itself to what I call a project of this worldly amelioration, of building a just or perfectly just social order, which of course is a rank impossibility, but increasingly both humanitarians and progressivists in the churches see humanitarianism as the effectual truth of the Christian religion. I would say that humanitarians have little sense of sin or limits. Progressivist Christians speak about structural sin. That means it's not in the soul or the heart, but it's bad structures, social structures. There's no intrinsic evil in the human soul. So humanitarianism entails a kind of frontal assault, spoken or unspoken, on the drama of good and evil in the human soul. As I said a moment ago, humanitarians tend to blame evil and criminality on unjust social structures, hence the emphasis on social sin, and believe, at least in principle, in the perfectibility of human beings in society. I would say at the political and cultural level, and we see this in the universities today, humanitarians dismiss the West uniquely as an essentially culpable civilization, racist, exploitative, and unjust. And in the 20th century, many were, not all, many were blind towards the totalitarian enemies of civilized order. Humanitarians' heart and soul is also pacifistic, believing in peace at any price, a view, by the way, that is particularly ascendant in progressive Catholic circles today, including this progressive papacy, and I'll come back to that in a little bit. I would say, and again these are generalizations, that humanitarianism, or the religion of humanity, has little or no place for the politics of prudence. What the great Anglo-Irish statesman, I add Irish because my last name is Mahoney, so. Burke, Edmund Burke, what other Irishman has a claim to being a political philosopher, right? Edmund Burke called the God of this world below. But as we shall see, humanitarianism tends to mix moralism and relativism in a truly toxic way. So we have all these doctrines in our universities and our cultural life that are officially relativistic, denying the good, or any access of reason or faith to the good, but are endlessly indignant, right? This, Michael Plagani, 60 years ago, called it a moral inversion. You sort of deny morality and open, it goes underground and comes out back out as a kind of fanaticism, of relativistic moralism. That's just a phenomenological description of everything we see around us today, mainly on the left, but also on the right. I would say, and again, these are generalizations, humanitarians have a soft spot for doctrinaire or fanatical egalitarianism, and typically confuse love of the poor with collectivist or socialist politics, although one must carefully add, humanitarians are not necessarily Marxists. I would say, I speak here as a Christian, most humanitarians are blind to or downplay of those totalitarianisms. He saw through the ideological pretenses of liberation theology. In his Jesus of Nazareth, Volume 1, he says, the church has its own program, that of the Good Samaritan, he said. It does not need the hate, the crude materialism, and the endless delusions about human nature typical of the Communist Manifesto. And I think it's fair to say the people around Pope Francis. Cardinal Mueller, the former head of the Congregation for the Defense of the Faith, who was summarily fired by the Pope 2 years ago, very centrist in his politics, but a firm traditional Catholic. Cardinal Mueller said, I'm afraid the Pope is surrounded by theological and political ignoramuses. I'm quoting Cardinal Mueller. You know, this is tough talk. But one has to wonder, when he went to Havana in 2015, he spoke about his unqualified admiration for Fidel Castro. Sylvia Bergioli, do you know her from NPR? You hear her in the car when you're driving home? She asked the Pope, well, when you met with Castro for 3 hours, did you bring up the persecution of the church? Christmas had been outlawed for 50 years in Cuba. And he said, no, I didn't bring any of that up. We talked about ecology. Fidel cares about ecology. Perhaps. He was very slow to face the truth about the Maduro regime in Venezuela. He rarely repeats the church's condemnation of totalitarian collectivism. And he abandoned the underground church, persecuted for 70 years in China. We now recognize essentially the party wing of the church. The Archbishop of Beijing, the Archbishop of Philadelphia just told me, is a member of the Politburo of the Communist Party and has been married for 30 years. So this is the guy who Rome now recognizes as the leader of the Catholic Church in China, and essentially throwing the faithful underground church under the bus. Also with, we don't expect popes to be cheerleaders for war. We want them to pray for peace. But we also want them to be realistic about the relationship between charity and our public obligations and the limits of pacifism. In a recent interview with Dominique Volton, a French social scientist, Pope Francis says, one always wins with peace, and there is never a just war. Now this, I think, is rank utopianism. In the Joy of the Gospel, he says, the Koran is incompatible with every form of violence and war. these simply are not true, right? Most Muslims would not claim that the Quran is a pacifistic document. So there's a kind of political correctness here. The Pope famously and arbitrarily, I don't think he has the power to do it, he's not an Oriental potentate, he changed the Catholic catechism to forbid capital punishment. But St. Paul and St. Augustine, even St. John Paul II, have said it ought to be reduced to bare minimums. None of them said it was intrinsically evil. He just changed it. Last week in an interview, he said lifetime imprisonment is immoral. Well, I think what's going on here is what C.S. Lewis, in the last essay he wrote, called a humanitarian theory of punishment. You know, all punishment is cruel because there's suffering. But this has much more to do with Beccaria than it has to do with an authentic Jewish or Christian understanding of criminal punishment by legitimate political authorities. So, in any case, my last remarks, I don't really intend them as a polemic against Pope Francis, but more as a reminder or just description of how a certain kind of humanitarianism has reached the upper echelons of the Roman Catholic Church. It was only Pio IX in 1864, the 80th of the Syllabus of Errors, was that the Holy Roman Pontiff should make his peace with liberalism, progress, and modern civilization. So as the cigarette commercial used to say, we've come a long way, baby. You know, now we have a global humanitarianism pact being sponsored by the Pope. It will be signed in Rome. It makes no reference of Christian categories. It's just an endorsement of global humanitarianism and a world governing authority. All right, I want to say a few final words about two Russian thinkers who saw this coming. One was the great Vladimir Solovyov, who lived from 1853 to 1900. He's an absolutely remarkable man. He translated all of Plato into Russian. He was a very serious and devout Christian. But his last work, War, Progress, and the End of History, which is a kind of dialogue. There's three major characters. There's Z, who represents Solovyov. There's the prince, who was a disciple of Tolstoy. And then there's the general, who seems to represent political reason. And what's so interesting, and it ends with this absolutely fascinating work called The Short Tale of the Antichrist, which Pope Benedict talks about in Jesus of Nazareth when he discusses the temptations of Christ in the desert. Because essentially, Solovyov says, if the Antichrist comes, he will be a global humanitarian, concerned with ecology, a pacifist, and he will displace all of the emphasis in Christian teaching from care of the soul to what we today would call social justice. And it's quite a riveting story, and I leave it to you to read it. But let me give you a little flavor of Solovyov. There was the Tolstoyan character, the prince, at one dramatic moment in the first book says, war is an absolute and utter evil of which humanity must rid itself at any cost and immediately. And he says to Mr. Z, the Solovyov representative, do you doubt that the complete and immediate suppression of this barbarism would result in any case in the triumph for reason and good? And Z shocks the prince by saying, I am positively certain of quite the opposite. And he went on to say, it is possible to have a good war, and it is also possible to have, and we sometimes do have, an evil peace. So that's the traditional Christian position, the position of Augustine, of St. Paul, of Augustine, of Reinhold Niebuhr, of Solovyov, of C.S. Lewis, that both C.S. Lewis and Reinhold Niebuhr wrote similar essays in the 1940s about why the Christian church is not pacifist. Francis is clearly on the other side of this matter. There was also a debate. The Tolstoyans, including the prince, had this view, goodness is so good that it will always conquer evil. Tolstoy, in his rewriting of the New Testament, and the Prince in the dialogues on World Progress and the End of History, talk about how the benignity of Christ can overcome all evil. But Soloviev says, through his character Z, there were two criminals on the cross with Jesus. The one who repented, and Jesus said, "This day you shall be with me in paradise." And the other one who didn't repent his murderous ways and went to hell. Jesus' benignity did not overcome Pilate, or Herod, or Judas, etc., etc. So this idea that the good will win without the prudence of... St. Thomas says in question 91 in the Treatise on Natural Law, human prudence, practical reason, that means will, free will, is part of God's providence. So we just don't sit back and wait for the Holy Ghost to help us out. We fight evil when necessary, so civilization is preserved. That's the nub of the debate between Z and the Prince. And I would say, but the short tale of the Antichrist, everyone loves it. And the funniest joke is he's a biblical scholar who studied into binging. In other words, the person possessed by Satan talks like a modern biblical scholar. You know, he's deconstructed traditional Christianity. So let me have a sense of humor. So it's this is a light note, you know, very unlike man's writings. And then I just wanted to say, it's very interesting in Solzhenitsyn's Big Red Wheel, his 10 volumes, 4 knots on the coming of the Bolshevik Revolution, which Solzhenitsyn, Alexander Solzhenitsyn, the great patriot dissident writer, as Danilov called him, Solzhenitsyn thought it was the great event of the 20th century, the sort of monstrous assault on Christianity and civilization and Europe. But he too takes on Tolstoy in the book. Make a long story short, the first volume of 1914 arrives when, begins when Sanya Lajhenitsyn, he's the barely fictionalized father of Solzhenitsyn. And in real life he was a Tolstoy, but he was also a patriot, and he just didn't buy this stuff about the benignity of the good. So he went to see the very old Tolstoy at Yasnaya Polyana, his great castle. He preached limitless poverty, but he lived in a nobles castle. And he said, look, evil has fangs in it. It has to be resisted. And Sanya Lajhenitsyn was also a patriot. And the fifth commandment in Tolstoy's rewritten New Testament says, have no loyalty to your country or nation. So Sanya Lajhenitsyn begins to turn away from Tolstoy because you might say his moral and political intuitions tell him that we ought to have loyalty to loyalty, as Josiah Royce said. So, no one's said that name around here in a long time. He was once a famous Harvard professor. There's a great, at the beginning of November 1916, there's a great Chinese prison. The church was outlawed until last year. You know, it's just hard to believe the blindness toward this hard utopianism. Now, let me come back to the sort of founding moment of modern humanitarianism, now that I've talked about some of its different hard and soft currents. Its explicit founder was Auguste Comte, who was bizarre. We all know Auguste Comte was bizarre. He declared himself the high priest of humanity at a ceremony outside of Notre Dame in 1851. He wrote a letter to the head of the Jesuits, the Pope, the Russian Tsar, and several others to come and watch his coronation. No one came, but he still was the high priest of humanity. And you may not know, he wanted the religion of humanity and Comtism to be international, the way Marxism became an international. And only one country took him up on the offer. The founders of the modern Brazilian Republic were disciples of Auguste Comte. So when Brazil wins the World Cup and you see that flag, order and progress, those are the symbols of Comte's religion of humanity. Okay. So Comte was a brilliant, if rather bizarre, sociologist and social theorist. He dismissed metaphysical and traditional reflection and thought, as he put it, that only how questions, not why questions matter. So all those points that Danilo said that Abigail Adams Institute dedicates itself, these questions of meaning. Comte said they're verboten, they're not compatible with positive science. We want to nail the coffin of metaphysics and traditional philosophy, and of course, biblical religion. And Comte, who invented the word altruism, wanted to replace what he called the love of humanity with a capital H. Remember the newspaper in Paris, the Communist Party newspaper was L'Humanité, with a capital H, for love of God. But authentic nobility entails, I think, the subordination of everything human to what is above man. Certainly that is the meaning of an authentic Christian humanism, which should never be confused with humanitarianism or the religion of humanity. In June of 1841, Comte declared that war was finished. It was an anachronism that commercial and industrial society would replace war. And because he thought of war in a bourgeois way. It was just a way to calculate and acquire. But you could acquire better through peaceful commerce. He also declared the nation to be obsolete in 1841. The age of industrial society had replaced the age of war, as the age of positive science had replaced the age of philosophy and religion and metaphysics. And he says it's starting with the avant-garde of humanity. And that meant Western Europe. I think most West European elites today think the same way. They don't follow the positivist calendar. Adam Smith is a saint of the positivist calendar, so is Francis Bacon. No Jesus, though. But anyway, no one's into the bizarrities of the actual religion that Comte invented, but the idea that Western Europe is the avant-garde of humanity, or at least the intellectual class in the Western world is the avant-garde of humanity, because they left God and the nation and a culpable West behind. That's Comteism, and it's a widely shared understanding of what the avant-garde of humanity consists of. I think Comte failed to see that this self-deification of man always leads to his self-enslavement, as the Hungarian philosopher Earl Kolnai once suggested. Let me say, on some of my analysis in the book follows that of my friend Pierre Benant, that the most striking features of Europe as the avant-garde of the West, or Western Europe, East Central Europe is sort of protesting, not quite going along with the new project. But it's a project that actively aims to promote depoliticization, getting rid of the old nations, the old political forms. Everyone comments on the democratic deficit of the European Union. The Irish voted wrong at one time, the Danes, the Dutch, and the French on the European Constitution in 2005. What was the response of Brussels? Vote again until you get it right. Because democracy is not the self-government of a people. It's a regla, it's a rule, it's a religion of humanity. If you don't get it right in the first 2 or 3 votes, you got to do it again, right? So I would say that the avant-garde of humanity is Comtean to the extent that it's committed to the jettisoning of nations and churches and all forms of human particularity. The goal is a unified humanity. This is much less sober than somebody like Immanuel Kant, who famously said in Perpetual Peace in 1795 that a world state would be a soulless despotism. And Comte even spoke of mankind, the crooked timber of humanity. But this idea that I would say in a rather humane and boring Germanic way, Jürgen Habermas is the representative of this, a post-political Europe that will culminate in a kind of collective United Nations. And he says in one of his recent books that I discuss in my book that, yes, his goal is the religion of humanity, but he's interesting because he has a caveat. He says, I wonder if modern man can defend a coherent notion of human dignity and freedom without a strong residue of the Christian past. So Habermas raises that interesting question. That's why he had the dialogue with, about the future of Europe with Cardinal Ratzinger before he became Pope Benedict XVI. Habermas has this reservation that maybe all this progressivism is parasitic on a kind of classical and Christian world that it officially repudiates. And I think that's quite interesting. All right. I would say that humanitarians forget the old philosophical and theological idea of mediation. In Aristotelian political philosophy, we have no access to the universal except through the particular experience, for example, of self-government of the city. In Christian theology, we don't know what God looks like. We see him mediated through the face of the incarnate Lord Jesus Christ, etc., etc. So but this idea that we can have a direct access to pure humanity, I think that's really very central to humanitarianism in its various forms. Now, one of the themes of my book is that, paradoxically, this religion of humanity, which is so obviously, emphatically, and openly hostile to Christian truth and revelation, has infiltrated the churches. Niebuhr talked about this 100 years ago, but he was talking about liberal Protestantism, Harnack and Bultmann. I think the most remarkable transformation of our time is how the pontificate of Pope Francis, or sort of the progressive wing of the Catholic Church, has more or less bought into this utopian moralizing and these ideological cliches. I think both Comte and Marx would be surprised to have so many followers within the churches, and especially the Church of Rome. I wrote a piece last year on somebody called me up and said, it's the bicentennial of Karl Marx's birth. He was born in 1818. Write a long piece on Marx's significance for the modern world. We'll have 4 or 5 people discuss it. So I did. Came across, when I was doing some reading, rereading major works of Marx, but also reading what people are saying about Marx today, I came across a remark from Cardinal Marx. He's the head of the German Catholic Bishops' Conference, which is sort of a perpetual revolt. They're the avant-garde of the Roman Catholic Church. Cardinal Marx said, well, if you look at Marx closely, his thought is very close to Catholic social thought. So I was going over this with my students, and I said, let's just look cursorily at, if you want a little sort of vulgate of Marxism, which is pretty true to the original, the second part of the Communist Manifesto. Marx talks about 4 abolitions. The abolition of the family. He says, well, the family doesn't really exist anyway because women are prostitutes in a bourgeois family arrangement. The nation, because in the end he dreams of a universal homogeneous state. Religion, religion's the opiate of the people. And property. Marx famously says in the middle of part 2 of the Communist Manifesto, communism can be summed up in a single sentence, the abolition of private property. Yet Cardinal Marx tells us that Catholic social thought and the Marxism of Marx are essentially coextensive. Very strange. Now let's say a word about Pope Benedict XVI's treatment of humanitarianism. He was the only leading Catholic thinker. There are some political philosophers, some of my friends in France at Pierre Menonte and Alain Bessasson, who've written a lot about this conflation of Christianity and the religion of humanity, Remy Brad. But Pope Benedict made it a major theme of his pontificate. So, for example, In his 2006 Regensburg address, he said, Christianity in no way can be reduced to a humanitarian moral message. And he develops that argument, I think, in a very compelling way. Benedict believed in political reason, the virtue of prudence, and informed by faith, and not in utopian moralism that ignored the drama of good and evil in the human soul. He understood, just as John Paul II volunteers for the army. He's fighting for his country in World War I. But he's still enough of a residual Tolstoyan, and that means pacifist, to feel very guilty about this. So he goes to the army chaplain. The remarkable thing is the army chaplain, his name is Father Severian, he is essentially a student of Soloviev. So we have a kind of representation of Soloviev's arguments against the pacifists, the Tolstoyans, the people who conflate or confuse secular humanitarianism with authentic religion. Let me just read you a few paragraphs, then I'll stop. So there's this really dramatic intervention. This guilt-ridden Sonia is talking to this extremely thoughtful Orthodox chaplain. And Father Severian shocks Sonia Lajnitsin by he says, I don't consider Tolstoy a Christian at all. He's a Rousseauan. He's guided by compassion. Of course, Rousseau was not a pacifist, but he did put compassion on the screen. Sonia Lajnitsin's jaw drops, and he asks, not at all? And the chaplain says, Tolstoy made a raid on the Gospels for his own purposes. He appealed to political passions and encouraged a hatred of church, country, and state. And Father Severian also argues against an interpretation of the Sermon on the Mount, which is really a hyper-literal interpretation which turns it into a political platform for radical pacifism. So, in the midst of a rather heated but friendly exchange, Father Severian says to Sonia that he does not consider, like Tolstoy, war to be the worst of evils. It is one evil among others tied up with the fallen nature of man. And the chaplain continues, at no time has the world been without war, not in 7 or 10 or 20,000 years. Neither the wisest of leaders, nor the noblest of kings, nor yet the church, none of them has been able to stop it. Hot-blooded socialists won't end it. Nor can we readily separate rational and just wars from the rest. War is the price we pay, he adds, for living in a state. Before we can abolish war, you will have to abolish states. But that is unthinkable until the propensity to violence and evil is out of human beings. A lawful state was created to protect us from violence and worse. And then in an accompanying passage, Father Severian lists 5 human evils worse than war. An unjust trial, for instance, that scalds the outraged heart is violent, or murder for gain. When the solitary murderer fully understands the implications of what he means to do and all that the victim will suffer at the moment of the crime, or the ideal at the hand of a torturer, when you can neither cry out or fight back nor attempt to defend yourself, or treachery on the part of someone you trusted, or mistreatment of widows and orphans. All these things are spiritually dirtier and more terrible than war. Just to move ahead in the red wheel, the core volumes deal with March 17, the disaster of this revolution that upended the Tsarist regime. The Vulgate and the rest is, this is wonderful. We had these freedom fighters, Milyukov and Kerensky's awful, by the way, if you read the video. Talking about no enemies to the left. But anyway, Solzhenitsyn said this was a disaster. Once these soft liberals and socialists came to power, they were outgunned, outmaneuvered by the ideologically Machiavellian Lenin in a minute. As Solzhenitsyn says, the provisional government governed for less than 2 hours. Trotsky said coming to power was as easy as picking up a pen. So Solzhenitsyn says the real fault here, and not that he was an admirable man, not a bad man, a terrible leader, incompetent, was the last Tsar of Russia, Nicholas. He had no political impulse. All he could care about was going back to his beloved Alexander and the children. The family, the family, the family. And he decided not to use force in Petersburg in February 1917, in part because he was a good Christian. He did not want to see blood flow. But this is Solzhenitsyn's commentary on Nicholas II. And you know, if you read the papers or read the magazine, Solzhenitsyn is this arch-orthodox reactionary. This is what he says about Nicholas: his refusal to use the power and the military arms of a legitimate state to defend itself against anarchy and totalitarianism. I quote, "Monarchy is a strong system on the condition that the monarch is not too pusillanimous." Nicholas II was pusillanimous. "Comport oneself as a Christian on the throne, so be it, but not to the point of forgetting one's duties or the nation's business in a way that blinds oneself to approaching catastrophe." So Solzhenitsyn says our Nicholas could have taken a series of defensive moves, sending reliable troops to the capital to crush the rebellion in Petersburg, make sure bread was readily available, cut the telegraph lines between Petersburg and Moscow. So people around Nicholas said, don't do it, there'll be some blood, maybe 100, maybe 200, more, maybe 300 people will die. And Solzhenitsyn says he was obliged to do it. And he says, and I want to read this, "Even if some had died in the effort to maintain a legitimate political order, this would not have had the least resemblance with the Civil War, Russian Civil War, which lasted 3 years on the vast expanses of Russia, with the criminal exactions of the Chekists, the secret police, the epidemic of typhoid, successive waves of crushed peasant rebellion, the Volga basin suffocated by famine, 5 million dead, and then a half-century of the internal gnashing of the Gulag." So Solzhenitsyn says in this commentary on the Red Wheel, he says, Nicholas betrayed us. He betrayed the country. And here is a Christian, a very serious Christian, saying Nicholas should have been more Machiavellian. Nicholas should have been Christian, but a Christian statesman still has to do what statesmen do. Protect the common good, protect the nation, and prevent the rise of the twin extremes of anarchism and totalitarianism. So I think you can see with Soloviev and Solzhenitsyn, they're both two great Christian anti-totalitarian thinkers, but they also saw this humanitarian corruption of Christianity, partly derived, not wholly derived, from Tolstoy, as having played a role in this terrible drama by weakening the will of those who might have resisted. And Solzhenitsyn says in The Red Wheel, maybe even worse than Tolstoy's pacifism is his endorsement of passivity. General Samsonov, who commits suicide in the forests of Poland after the Battle of Tannenberg. The man has no spring of action. He has been taught by Tolstoy that history has a logic of its own and human beings have nothing to do with it. Solzhenitsyn suggests that's not a good attitude for a general, Christian or not. Anyway, I'm going to stop there. I threw a lot of stuff on the table, but I wanted to give you a sense of why I think the religion of humanity is a mortal threat to the integrity of the Christian religion, why it's a mortal threat to the integrity of decent politics, and how it's become strangely, not dominant, but influential and in some circles ascendant in the religious circles of our time. Thank you.